So we have a saying in English, the writing on the wall. The writing is on the wall. You guys familiar with that saying? The writing is on the wall. It means that there are clear signs that something's going to happen. Usually something bad is going to happen. And so you say the writing is on the wall. I saw it coming, basically. For example, someone might say that, okay, no one told me I'm going to lose my job, but I see that the business is going down, it's going bankrupt. The writing is on the wall that I'm going to lose my job. If we see a couple, maybe a man and woman, and the relationship isn't going well, they're fighting with each other all the time, we say, well, the writing's on the wall, that relationship's going to end. That's what it means, the writing on the wall. And this phrase, I don't know if you know this, actually comes from Daniel chapter 5. Okay, Daniel 5 is the origin of that saying because Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, literally saw the writing on the wall, didn't he? He saw the writing on the wall. He saw his doom spelled out on the wall. Fingers, it says the fingers of a man's hand appeared and was writing. What did he write? Many, many tekel ufsarim, right? And so, unfortunately for him, by the time he saw the writing on the wall, it was already too late for him. Judgment was already determined, and he was about to die and lose his kingdom. There were plenty of signs that he and all of Babylon were going to fall, but he didn't see the signs. He was blind to the signs. And sadly, he saw the writing on the wall when it was too late to do anything about it. So let's start by talking about this man, Belshazzar. So open up your Bibles if you aren't there yet, Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5 opens up by saying, Belshazzar the king. Belshazzar the king. That's how we're introduced to him. And so as we go from chapter 4 to 5, we kind of have this sudden jump in history. We've been talking about Nebuchadnezzar, the first 4 chapters, and all of a sudden, without any description of the transition from the kings, all of a sudden Belshazzar is in this position. And so he's gone, Nebuchadnezzar is gone, Belshazzar is called the king. So history records that King Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC. And after he died, Babylon really didn't have much time left. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar was the main guy for Babylon. After he was gone, there was like a couple kings. One guy lasted, I think, like 2 months or a couple months. Another guy was like 2 years. And then Belshazzar here was about 13 years. And Belshazzar was actually Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. Okay, his grandson. It says in the text here it was his son, Nebuchadnezzar's son, but actually history shows us that he was actually his grandson. And even this small point shows us how accurate God's prophecy is. Because if you look at Jeremiah 27, so keep your finger here in Daniel 5, but Jeremiah 27 kind of even shows that it would be Nebuchadnezzar's grandson that would finish out Babylon. Jeremiah 27, verses 6 and 7. Jeremiah 27, 6 and 7. It says, And now have I given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. And the beasts of the field have I given also to him to serve him. And all nations shall serve him, so Nebuchadnezzar, and his son, and his son's son. So that would be his grandson. Until the very time of his land come, and then many nations and great kings shall serve themselves of him. So just a small point there of how accurate God is in his prophecy. Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's son's son and became king here in Daniel 5. Technically, if we look at history, Belshazzar wasn't officially the king of Babylon. He had a father named Nabonidus. And he was the actual king, but Nabonidus was like not just an absent father, but an absent king. He wasn't around. He was off in Arabia, a little bit west of Babylon, for actually about 10 years. So in practice, Belshazzar was the guy. He was the king of Babylon. And so he was acting as the king, but in chapter 5, we see how he acted as a king. He was throwing a party. Okay, chapter 5 introduces him not just as a king, but a king who's throwing a wild party. He was drunk with a lot of people. It says in verse 1, it was 1,000 of his lords, but there were other people there. It says later on there in verse 2, there were his wives, his concubines. And so I'm sure there was a lot of sinful things happening at this party. And so we see in verse 1 an introduction to this party. So I'm in Daniel 5 again. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. Okay. And so it opens up with this party. And if we didn't know the historical context of what's happening in this point in history, we would just think that life was good. They're celebrating because Babylon's a great kingdom, we're doing well. Life was just fine. They were just drinking, having a good time to celebrate how good things were in Babylon. But the reality is that the truth was far from that. Things were not well in Babylon at this point. The reality was, as they were having this party, they were actually surrounded by all the Medes and Persians. Okay, the armies were surrounding them and surrounded Babylon, and they actually had a siege around the city of Babylon for about several months already before this party started. Okay, the year of Belshazzar here in chapter 5 is 539 BC. So this is just 23 years after Nebuchadnezzar died. And yet Babylon quickly went down, quickly declined. The Medes and Persians were just slowly shrinking their empire, the Babylonian empire. They were taking area after area. And so by the time we get to Daniel 5, in the year 539 BC, Babylon is just the city of Babylon. That's where they're having this party, in the city, and they're having this party as they're surrounded. The whole city is surrounded by Medes and Persians. And so Babylon was under siege, and yet the reason maybe they felt secure is because Babylon as a city was a well-fortified city. Very thick walls, very high walls. I think they say some of the walls were as high as 100 feet tall. So we're talking about very, very great walls fortifying. It was like a giant fortress. And it had a large amount of area within those walls. And actually, they had farmland. They had crops inside of Babylon, of the city. And so the reason they actually could have farmland in there is because they had the Euphrates River flowing actually through the city. They had it so that the river would flow under the walls, come in through the north, go through the entire city, and then exit the south wall, under the wall. And so that allowed them to endure a siege. They would have water to drink. They'd have water for their crops. They could grow food. So in their minds, they're thinking they can continue for a long time. They can endure this siege. They had this sense of security. However, the city had a weakness. The same thing that was strong for them was also their weakness, because the Euphrates River came in and out through under the wall, but that also provided a point to come into the city. Okay, they could come in through that opening under the wall. So it was great to have the river coming through because it provided water for themselves and for the crops. But it also provided the enemy an opportunity to enter through there. And that's exactly what the Medes and Persians did. They basically stopped up the Euphrates River, so the water stopped flowing. So if the water's gone, sorry. I get excited talking about war history. Sorry. Yeah. So yeah, basically the water, once they stopped the water, they would go upstream, stop the water. So now what do you have? You just have a dry water bed. You have a tunnel. You have a tunnel just to go under. So if the water stopped, you have an entry point at the north part of the city as well as the south. And so the Medes and Persians went in through the dry riverbed, and that's how they took Babylon. And that's what happens basically by the end of this chapter. Verse 28, Daniel says, the meaning of the writing on the wall, part of that is that the kingdom of Babylon would be given to the Medes and Persians. And in verse 30, in that very same night that he received this writing on the wall, the Medes and Persians came in, took control of Babylon, and that was the end of Babylon. And Belshazzar was killed in the process. So slowly we're seeing how that statue, you guys remember the statue from chapter 2, from Nebuchadnezzar's dream? So that's starting to take shape. The head of gold is Babylon, and now we have the arms of silver, Media and Persia. So this was the end of Babylon. And Belshazzar was the one to see, again, the writing on the wall. It was a writing that declared two things. It declared his own doom, but also the doom of the entire kingdom of Babylon. So as we think of Babylon's downfall, we need to remember God knew it all. God knew that when Babylon would fall. Again, he is sovereign. He's in control of kings and kingdoms. And we know through the prophets that God explained that he would use Babylon to bring judgment on Israel. Okay, that's why he brought Babylon. And yet what's interesting, when we look at the prophets, he also said he would bring judgment on Babylon for bringing judgment on Israel in a way. And that's exactly what happens. This is what's happening here. It's part of God's judgment on Babylon. But specifically, Belshazzar is the one who suffers the judgment. All of Babylon falls, but it's Belshazzar who's king in control when Babylon falls. Why Belshazzar? Why didn't God just say, okay, Nebuchadnezzar, I'm using you during this time, and now you're gone, and we'll just end Babylon? Or why not one of the other kings in between before Belshazzar? And I think as we look at this chapter, we may see some specific reasons why Belshazzar was the one sitting on the throne when judgment came to Babylon. The writing on the wall seems specifically written for him because of what he was doing. And the reason, we see this in the opening verses. Again, Belshazzar and his buddies are partying like everything's fine, life is good. But he was just ignoring the reality of the army surrounding his city. And in his drunkenness, he made some very bad decisions. Okay. It says in verse 2, whiles he tasted the wine. Okay, that's how verse 2 starts. Belshazzar, whiles he tasted the wine, while he was drinking, he committed two sins, two very heinous sins. The sins of blasphemy and the sins of idolatry. Blasphemy and idolatry. We see his blasphemy in verses 2 and 3. Let's read verses 2 and 3. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem. And the king and his princes and wives and his concubines drank in them. So why did they do this? Okay, they had plenty of cups there. I'm sure they had other cups sitting in the shelf. They could have gone to the kitchen, got something to drink out of. It's not that they didn't have other cups to drink their alcohol out of. It wasn't out of necessity they said, bring the golden cups, the vessels from Jerusalem. What we see here is that he chose to do this. Even though he was drunk, he still must have been aware that the sacredness of the temple vessels. And yet he purposely chose to take these vessels, these things that were used to worship the God of Israel, and he profaned them by filling it with alcohol and getting drunk out of it. This was blasphemy. It's like somebody coming into our church, walking up to me, ripping a page out of my Bible and blowing his nose with it, even though there's a box of tissues sitting right over there. Okay? He was just profaning something that God had given to worship him. Belshazzar didn't need to do this. He didn't need to bring the golden vessels to drink his wine. Rather, he intentionally did it to disrespect the God of Israel. Belshazzar wasn't just guilty of this sin of blasphemy, but also of idolatry. So he's already drinking, getting drunk out of these golden vessels from the temple. And in addition to that, what does he do in verse 4? They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. Okay? So he's not just profaning these holy, these things from the temple, but he's also, at the same time, worshiping these idols. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about how God is a jealous God. Okay? And we talked about how he's jealous for his own glory. And the reason he hates pride is because pride is when we compete with God's glory. And so God hates idolatry for the same reason. Belshazzar and the other Babylonians were praising these gods of gold and silver and wood and stone, all these idols. And God is jealous of such praise because he knows that all praise belongs or should go to him. God doesn't like to compete for our praise. And so Belshazzar committed this sin, both blasphemy and idolatry. And Daniel really explains the full extent of his sins in verse 23. So later on, when Daniel interprets the writing on the wall, he spells it out for Belshazzar in verse 23. This is what you did so wrong, Belshazzar. Verse 23 says, "But thou hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you, before thee, and thou, and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drunk wine in them. And thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified." And so basically here he's summarizing what we just read in verses 2 to 4, but he also adds two other things to focus on. Number one, he's pointing out that by praising these idols, he was ignoring the true God who gave him the very breath in his nostrils. Okay? The one who gives him his very life. He's saying, Belshazzar, your sin is that you ignored the very creator, the one who created you, and you're going over to these just statues on the wall and saying, praise you for all that you do, ignoring the very God who gave him everything, including his kingdom. He chose to ignore the God who created him. The God in whose hand thy breath is how Daniel puts it. You have not glorified him. And that's a great way to anger a jealous God, to ignore the one who created you and to look at something else in your life and say, this is what deserves my praise. This is what deserves my attention. Again, God doesn't like that competition. So if you're going to praise someone for what's happening in your life, you do it to the one who gave you the very breath inside of you. So Belshazzar praised and glorified these idols instead of the God who gave him life. But Daniel points out something else here in verse 23. These are really, the blasphemy and the idolatry are really symptoms of his greater sin, which is what we talked about before, pride. He said, you lifted yourself up in pride, just like your granddaddy, Nebuchadnezzar. And that's actually, we'll look at that probably next time, but in the previous verses, he talks about, you knew this. You knew that your grandfather fell because of pride, and yet here you are, lifting yourself up in pride. It says that you lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. So we have this interesting title, Lord of heaven. It's very similar to the title we looked at in chapter 4, the Most High. Okay, remember the Most High, used many times in chapter 4. Yes. So, okay. Oh, okay. They raptured without us. Okay. Should we wait for him or? No. Say this title, Lord of Heaven, very similar to the Most High. And so what he's saying here again is just like Nebuchadnezzar lifted himself up Okay. Just like Nebuchadnezzar lifted himself up, now here's his grandson doing the same thing, lifting himself up in pride. So all of this was a display of Belshazzar's pride. It was really a display of it's why he blasphemed and why he was worshiping these idols, all because of this pride. And all of it was leading him to God's judgment. So verse 5, we see literally the writing on the wall for Belshazzar because of all this. Verse 5 says, "In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote." It's written, "In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand." Same hour. It means it wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't like he was doing all these blasphemous things and praising the idols, and all of a sudden, here comes the hand to write it. But it means that it was in connection to the things he was doing is why the writing on the wall came. That same hour, God brought his judgment very quickly. Verse 24 makes that even more clear, that the writing on the wall came in relation to his idolatry and blasphemy and pride. It was a result. God's judgment came as a result of these sins. Verse 24 says, "Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written." So he's saying it's because of these things, your pride, blasphemy, and idolatry, that this writing on the wall came. So Belshazzar is having a good old time at his party, and God crashed that party pretty quick. And Belshazzar was here acting like a young, foolish man. People always try to give excuses why they do what they do, and some people say, "Oh, I was young and dumb when I did these things." There's really no good excuse for sinning in such a way, but if we were to describe him, I would actually describe him according to Ecclesiastes 11:9. Solomon has a good description for young, foolish men who act in such a way. Ecclesiastes 11:9. Ecclesiastes 11:9 says, "Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth, and walk in the ways of thine heart, and in the sight of thine eyes." So if we just stop there, like, why is Solomon saying just have a good time when you're young and do whatever, ma balacha, whatever comes to you, whatever you feel like doing? But he doesn't stop there. "But know thou," if you're going to behave like this, just follow whatever wickedness is in your heart, "that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment." Okay? So Belshazzar was this young man having a good time, partying it up, but the writing was on the wall. Judgment, his sins brought God's judgment. And as those fingers were writing on the wall, Belshazzar was shaking in his boots. He was scared, very scared. Verse 6. Okay, he was drunk, having a good time, partying. The writing on the wall came, and he changed completely shooken. Verse 6 says, "The king's countenance was changed." So his actual appearance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. His knees were shaking. Okay, God's judgment is a scary thing. This is what was happening. His judgment was coming. He became pale, troubled. It says his knees smote one against another, and the joints of his loins were loosed. Different people have different understanding of what that means. Some people even think it means that he lost control of his bowels. Okay, he was scared very much. Again, God's judgment is a scary thing. That's not a place we want to be. God's judgment. And so Belshazzar obviously wants help. Verses 7 to 9, he looks to where his grandfather looked, to the wise men, to the magicians, the sorcerers. But once again, we see that they were useless. They couldn't help. They couldn't figure it out. He wanted to know what the writing meant, and they were no help. So verses 10 to 12, we then see a mention of a queen. And we think of queen, we think, okay, this must be Belshazzar's wife. But the reality is she wasn't there at the party, and other indication seems to be that this wasn't his wife, but maybe like they used to have like the previous king's wives. If they were still alive, they'd be considered the queen. It's possible this was Nebuchadnezzar's widow. Whoever it was, she was familiar with Daniel, and basically tells Belshazzar, you're looking in the wrong place for help. There's a man named Daniel who can help you. And also tells us a bit something about how sinful and how far from God Belshazzar was. He didn't even know who Daniel was, and he was there in the same city. And so she suggests Daniel to come. He calls Daniel to help him. Daniel's an old man at this point, maybe 85 years old. And yet God's still using him. Actually, during the time of Belshazzar, Daniel writes his prophecies of chapters 7 and 8. So we're going to talk about his prophecies in 7 and 8. But here, once again, Daniel is called upon to make an interpretation. And he interprets the writing on the wall. So let's jump to that interpretation. What was on the wall? What was the writing on the wall for Belshazzar? Verses 25 to 28. Let's read that. And this is the writing that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene. God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Paris, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So this is the interpretation of the writing. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Three words that, Aramaic words. As far as I understand, all three of these words could be used to describe a unit of money. Okay, a mina, which is a currency, a shekel, and a half piece of silver. But these three words can also be used as verbs, and that's how Daniel interprets them here. Okay, the words mean numbered, weighed, and divided. That's what he's saying to Belshazzar. You have been numbered, weighed, and divided. So mene, verse 26, God had numbered the days of Belshazzar and his kingdom, meaning God knows the days. He knows when our days are going to run out. He knew when the days of Belshazzar were going to run out. You want to come through here, buddy? Okay. Time had run out. His days were numbered, and the days were over for Babylon and for Belshazzar. Verse 27, tekel. Tekel, meaning God had weighed. What does it say in verse 27? You are weighed in the balances and found wanting. He had weighed Belshazzar's actions. And the idea here is the scale. You guys know the old-fashioned scale. You put on one side something to compare to, and then you put a weight on the other side to determine how much of something is. And so what he's saying is that to Belshazzar, you've been put on this scale. And on the one side is Belshazzar's actions, his morality, his blasphemy, his idolatry, his pride. And on the other side, something's not in balance, because on the other side you have God's righteousness. They're out of balance. Belshazzar, you're out of balance. And the result is, he says, you are found wanting. You are means you're lacking something. Your sin over here and the way you're living your life is out of balance compared to God's righteousness. The result is you're found wanting. You're lacking righteousness. The scale was out of balance. He was full of pride. All the pride and blasphemy and idolatry was not equal to God's righteousness. So it says God numbered the days of Belshazzar. He was weighed in the balances and found wanting. And as a result, verse 28, Paris, his kingdom would be taken away and given to the Medes and Persians. And in the process, he would be killed. This was God's judgment on Belshazzar. This was the writing on the wall, his doom spelled out from God. He saw the writing on the wall, but he saw it too late. By the time the writing was there, judgment was pronounced. And as we consider this, and consider this in relation to the people in our lives, think about lost people in our lives who don't know Yeshua, we can probably say the same thing. The writing on the wall is against all lost people. And most lost sinners don't know the writing on the wall, the destruction, the judgment that is spelled out against them because of their sins. We can almost imagine for each one of us writing out, God or whoever, writing out a list of every sin we've ever committed, condemning us. And we see the people around us, lost sinners, partying it up like Belshazzar, living life foolishly as young people sometimes, not aware of the writing on the wall against them. They also need to listen to King Solomon's words from Ecclesiastes. They're out there in their youth sometimes, and even if they're not young people, they're out there walking in the ways of their own heart, in the sight of their own eyes. But again, the admonition in Ecclesiastes 11:9 is, but know this, that for all these things, all the things you're doing, the things you're pursuing, the sin that you are deeply involved with, these things God will bring thee into judgment. Judgment is coming. The writing is on the wall for all lost sinners. Sinners like Belshazzar, whose life was put on a scale and he was found wanting. He came up short of God's righteousness. And that's the situation for every sinner. Without Yeshua, we are out of balance because our sin puts us in one place out of balance with God's righteousness. There's only one thing we can do to balance out the scale. There's the only thing we can put on the other side of the scale to level out the problem we have with sin. And if our sin is whatever it is, blasphemy, idolatry, pride, or really anything else, lying, cheating, stealing, there's only one thing that's going to balance that scale. The one thing every sinner needs, that is the righteousness of Yeshua to match us with the righteousness of God. Our good works aren't going to level the scale. Our church attendance doesn't level the scale. Our charitable giving doesn't level the scale. The only thing we can do to make that scale level so that we're not found wanting like Belshazzar is to repent of our sins and trust in Yeshua. Only then will he impute. It means he will put to account, he will credit us. He will put on that scale his righteousness, and that is able to put us level, to be able to stand before a holy and righteous God. We call this justification as the theological term. The scale is level because Yeshua gives us his righteousness to stand before God. And we all can give testimony of our lives before Yeshua. We were way out of balance. Some of us felt maybe more out of balance than others. I know I felt way out of balance at the age of 24 is when God saved me. And before that, I was exactly like the man in Ecclesiastes 11, just young, partying it up, having fun, focused on myself. Blasphemer, idolater, proud, no idea that there was writing on the wall against me because of my sins. God's judgment written out. No idea that judgment was coming until somebody showed me the writing on the wall. And that's what we need to be doing to the lost people around us, showing them the writing on the wall that is pronounced against every lost sinner. For Belshazzar, he saw the writing on the wall, but it was too late. He died that same night. But our desire, I know my desire, and I trust it's each of our desires for the people in our lives that still don't see the writing on the wall, that we share the gospel with them. Let's be faithful to preach the gospel, show them the writing on the wall, God's judgment coming to all of us. We are all sinners, all deserving God's judgment. But by his love and grace, he sent Yeshua to die on the cross for us. Amen.